Welcome to the My Bard story.
Hello, everyone. So today we're really embarking on a pretty compelling deep dive into Genesis chapter 16.
That's right, a really central narrative focusing on Hagar and Ishmael.
Exactly, and that whole complex interplay between, human plans and divine promises.
We'll be drawing from our study note today, which gathers insights from quite a range of commentaries and scholarly reflections.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
And this passage, it really lays bare Sarai's struggle with infertility, doesn't it?
It does. And her initiative, her plan to have Abram father a child through Hagar, her Egyptian slave.
Which, of course, leads to all sorts of unexpected consequences.
Absolutely. It's a story just packed with human emotion, cultural context.
And some profound theological implications that honestly still resonate with us today.
For sure. So our mission really in this deep dive is to unpack the key events.
And understand that ancient Near Eastern context that really sheds light on why they acted the way they did.
Right. And also to look closely at Hagar's unique encounters with God, with the divine.
We're hoping to uncover some of those, aha moments that maybe get overlooked sometimes.
Yeah, and think about what they mean for how we understand God's character and maybe even our own lives.
Okay, let's begin then. We'll look closely at our study note, starting with Genesis 16, verse 1 from the NIV. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar.
Okay, so right away, notice how it identifies her. Sarai, Abram's wife. And then immediately the issue, had borne him no children.
Yeah, that pairing is stark. It sets up the core tension, especially given the promises God had already made to Abram about descendants, right?
Exactly. It's a direct challenge to those promises. And then Hagar is introduced an Egyptian slave.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Waltke, in his commentary, really emphasizes this. It introduced the human element, the attempt to kind of intervene in God's plan.
And that Egyptian origin, Waltke suggests it might echo Abram's earlier time in Egypt.
Yeah, potentially. It's subtle, but it might hint at, patterns or recurring themes. Adds a layer of complexity right from the start.
That's fascinating. It does add complexity. Okay, moving on to verse 2 then. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said.
So Sarai attributes her infertility to the Lord, which, was a common theological viewpoint back then.
Right, seeing God as sovereign over life and birth.
But then what follows is, well, it's a human initiative, isn't it? A plan based on the culture.
Not seemingly based on asking God for guidance first.
No. And that phrase, build a family, the Hebrew yabana, literally means be built. It reflects those ancient Near Eastern surrogacy practices.
Which we know about from things like the Code of Hammurabi and the Nutsi texts, right?
Exactly. It was a known legal and social custom. But crucially, notice Abram just agrees.
Yeah, his agreement seems quite quick.
And scholars like Baldwin, in the Tyndale commentary, point out the parallel to Adam listening to Eve in Genesis 3.
Oh, interesting. So suggesting maybe a departure from God's intended path.
Potentially, yeah. Waltke really expands on this too, this tendency we have to take matters into our own hands when God seems slow.
It really shows how faith in God's power can sometimes clash with, well, a lack of faith in his timing or methods.
Huh.
Okay, let's look at verse 3. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife.
And that detail, 10 years living in Canaan, that's not accidental.
No, it really ramps up the feeling of desperation, doesn't it? 10 years of waiting.
Absolutely. Waltke and Baldwin both note this. It underscores the pressures Sarai must have felt.
And her actions here. She took Hagar and gave her to Abram.
Again, echoing Eve's actions with the fruit in Genesis 3, as Waltke points out. That linguistic link is quite telling.
It really emphasizes the human initiative, maybe even manipulation involved.
And while the text says to be his wife, Isha, her actual status, as Waltke clarifies, was really more like a concubine.
Right, primarily for bearing children, not with the same status as Sarai. Hagar is quite passive in this transaction.
Very much so. A tool in Sarai's plan.
Okay, verse 4 shows the immediate result. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress.
So conception happens immediately for Hagar, which must have just heightened the contrast with Sarai's barrenness.
You can only imagine the tension that created instantly.
Right. And then Hagar's reaction.
Mm-hmm.
She despised Sarai. Now, the Hebrew word here, qual, is fascinating.
How so?
Well, scholars like Waltke and Sailhammer note it shares a root with the word for curse back in Genesis 12.3, where God promises to curse those who curse Abram.
Wow. So Hagar's contempt isn't just personal pride. It might be linked to opposing God's blessing.
It potentially carries that weight. Her newfound status as the one carrying the heir clearly threatens Sarai's position in the household. It's a power shift.
That linguistic link is really profound. It lifts the conflict beyond just household jealousy. Okay, let's read verse 5, Sarai's reaction. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong happen. I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me."
So Sarai immediately blames Abram. She uses the word eidos, translated wrong here.
What does Emma's usually imply?
It often means something like injustice, malicious falsehood, even violence. It's a strong accusation.
Even though this was her idea in the first place.
Exactly. She initiated the plan, but now she shifts the blame for the fallout entirely onto Abram.
And she calls on the Lord to judge between them. It shows how deeply wronged she feels.
Deeply wronged, humiliated, her status threatened. Walke really emphasizes this sense of her position being undermined.
It just shows how quickly these human solutions can unravel into blame and broken relationships. What about Abram's response in verse 6? "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her.
Abram's response is, well, remarkably passive, isn't it?
Yeah, your slave is in your hands. He basically washes his hands of the immediate problem.
He gives Sarai full authority. Now that phrase, "do with her whatever you think best," hadedemeg ishla, could imply just treatment.
But Sarai clearly doesn't interpret it that way.
No. The text says Sarai mistreated
Oh, yeah.
in Hagar. And this is really significant.
Why is that?
Because Ina is the very same Hebrew word used later in Genesis 15 to describe Israel's future oppression in Egypt.
Oh, wow. So there's an ironic parallel being drawn.
A powerful one. Hagar, the Egyptian, experiences the same kind of mistreatment that Abram's descendants will later suffer in Egypt. Walke and others highlight this.
And Hagar's response is to flee. Bra.
Yes, another verb that echoes Israel's future escape from Egypt in Exodus. These connections are subtle but deep.
That connection is really striking. Okay, so Hagar flees. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur.
And here we have the first explicit mention in Genesis of the angel of the Lord, the Malach YHWH.
A figure often representing God's direct presence, right? Especially in crisis moments.
Exactly. Often seen as God himself, appearing, intervening. And notice, the angel found Hagar.
Yeah, that implies God took the initiative. He sought her out.
He did, in her distress, in the desert, and the location near a spring on the road to Shur.
What's significant about Shur?
Shur means wall. It likely refers to the Egyptian border defenses. It's the way back to Egypt.
So, as an Egyptian, she's probably trying to go home, to safety, as she sees it.
Makes perfect sense. Fleeing mistreatment, heading towards the familiar.
It's quite a picture, God finding her even as she runs away. Let's see what the angel says in verse 8. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered.
The angel addresses her very specifically. Hagar, slave of Sarai. It acknowledges her reality, her social position.
And then asks those questions. Where have you come from and where are you going?
Which aren't for the angel's information, surely. God would know.
Right, so they must be for Hagar's benefit, to make her think.
Exactly. Leading questions to prompt reflection. And notice her answer.
She only says where she's come from. "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai."
But nothing about where she's going. It shows her aimlessness, maybe her lack of a real future plan at that point, as Walke observes.
She knows what she's escaping, but not what she's heading towards. Okay, the angel's command in verse 9 is quite challenging. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her."
Yeah, go back and submit. That sounds incredibly hard, especially after the mistreatment.
Submit hidani. How does that relate to the mistreatment she suffered?
Well, fascinatingly, as Walke points out, it's from the exact same Hebrew root, horna. Sarai mistreated in a peeled stem, and Hagar is told to submit or humble herself. Hidani, hith pale stem.
So the very language connects her submission to the suffering she experienced.
It seems to imply that returning means facing continued hardship. But it's presented as the path of obedience God requires of her right then.
It really speaks to how obedience can sometimes mean returning to very difficult situations, trusting God has a purpose in it.
God often does ask people to go back to hard places for his reasons. But then, right after the command, comes a promise in verse 10.
The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count.
This is remarkable. After telling her to go back to hardship, the angel gives her this massive promise.
A promise that sounds just like the ones given to Abram.
Exactly. Too numerous to count. Genesis 13, Genesis 15. It shows God's grace extending even here to Hagar.
To someone considered marginalized, a slave, a foreigner.
And significantly, she's the only woman in Genesis to directly receive such a promise from God about numerous descendants. It's extraordinary.
It really underscores how God's care reaches beyond our usual boundaries.
Okay, verse 11 gets even more specific about her son. The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery."
So the angel confirms her pregnancy, tells her it's a son, and gives him a name, Ishmael, Yimael.
Which means God has heard.
Precisely, and the reason given connects directly back to her suffering. For the Lord has heard of your misery on yoke.
There's that honor root again. Misery, mistreatment, submission, God hears it all.
Yes, it emphasizes God's awareness of her specific pain. And notice the names for God used here.
The name is Ishmael, God, but the explanation says the Lord, YHWH, heard.
Right. Wald points this out. It shows the interchangeability. The God who heard Hagar is the covenant God, YHWH.
The naming itself becomes a powerful testimony. Verse 12 gives a prophecy about Ishmael. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. A very vivid poetic description. A wild donkey of a man, paradam.
What did that image signify back then?
In the ancient Near East, the wild donkey symbolized independence, freedom, an untamed nature, survival in harsh environments. Think Job 39.
Okay, so maybe not entirely negative, but definitely suggesting a different kind of life.
Right. And his hand against everyone, everyone's hand against him, that points towards ongoing conflict.
And living in hostility toward, or maybe opposite, his brothers.
Yeah, the Hebrew al-Poneh is debated, but it clearly foreshadows tension between Ishmael's descendants and Abraham's other descendants, especially through Isaac. We see hints later in Genesis.
It's quite a destiny foretold. But Hagar's response in verse 13 is amazing. She focuses on God. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me."
This is just incredible. Her focus isn't on her son's future, but on God's character revealed to her right there.
She names God. Ataljo, "You are the God who sees me."
And her exclamation, "I have now seen the one who sees me." It captures her awe, maybe even shock, at encountering God directly in the wilderness and surviving. Like Jacob later, or Moses.
And scholars like Wiersbe point out she's the only person in the Bible to actually give God a name.
Exactly. It highlights just how personal and transformative this encounter was for her.
That personal naming is truly unique. And it leads to the naming of the place in verse 14. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there, between Kadesh and Bered.
Bir Lahai Roi, Bir Lahai Root, meaning something like, well of the living one who sees me.
A permanent memorial to this divine encounter.
Right, a landmark commemorating God seeing and caring for Hagar. And it pops up later associated with Isaac, interestingly enough.
It becomes a place marker imbued with deep spiritual significance. Verse 15 shows Hagar's obedience. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born.
So she obeys, returns, and bears the son. And significantly, it's Abram who names him Ishmael.
Which shows he accepts Hagar's account of the divine encounter, right? And accepts the son.
It certainly seems so. And Waltke makes an important point here. Notice the contrast with verse 2.
Sarai wanted to build a family through her.
But the text here emphasizes 3 times that Hagar bore Abram a son. It subtly reframes the situation away from Sarai's initial plan.
Interesting. It highlights the direct Hagar-Abram connection regarding the child. Finally, verse 16 gives Abram's age. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael.
86. This age is crucial chronologically.
Because God reappears when Abram is 99, right? Before Isaac is born.
Exactly. So there's this 13-year gap between Ishmael's birth and God's next major revelation concerning the promised heir, Isaac, who's born on Abraham is 100.
That 13-year silence, it must have been a real test of faith for Abram.
A significant period of waiting, underscoring God's timing versus human timing.
Wow. Unpacking these verses really shows how much depth there is in just this one chapter. Okay, now let's transition a bit. Scholars have spent a lot of time thinking about this passage, often finding layers of meaning or connections we might miss. It's fascinating to see how they illuminate the text, sometimes giving us those aha moments. What are some of those key scholarly reflections that really stand out for you regarding Genesis 16?
Well, one area that scholars like Waltzy really dig into is the significance of Hagar being Egyptian. It's not just a random detail.
Right, we touched on that briefly. How does it play out in the bigger picture?
Well, think about Abram's story so far. Egypt, back in Genesis 12, was a place of, well, both temptation and trouble for him.
Okay, so Hagar's origin carries that symbolic weight.
Potentially, yes. It might foreshadow the complex, often difficult relationship Israel would later have with Egypt.
Oh, that makes sense.
And on a more practical narrative level, it explains why Ishmael later marries an Egyptian woman and why his descendants are often located near Egypt's borders in later texts. It all fits together.
It really weaves her personal story into the larger national narrative. What about the surrogacy aspect? Sarai's plan.
Yeah, understanding the ancient Near Eastern context there is absolutely crucial. Sarai's idea wasn't out of the blue.
It reflected actual cultural practices.
Definitely. Scholars like Spicer, looking at texts like the Code of Hammurabi, section 146, and the Nusi tablets, show this was a recognized, even legally structured way for a barren wife to provide an heir through her slave.
So the child born would legally belong to the mistress?
Generally, yes, that was the arrangement, though the specifics could vary. Van Cedars even notes this custom lasted a long time, so it's tricky to use it to precisely date Genesis.
But knowing that background helps us understand Sarai's actions weren't seen as completely bizarre in her time, even if they weren't God's ideal plan.
Exactly. It contextualizes it, separates the cultural norm from the theological implications of acting outside God's specific guidance.
Okay, and another big topic is the identity of the angel of the Lord. Who or what is this figure?
Right, the Melech YHWH. There's a lot of discussion on this. In this chapter, the figure speaks as God, uses I for divine promises.
And Hagar addresses him as the Lord and names God based on the encounter.
Precisely. So many scholars, people like Walt Kack, Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary, even older scholars like von Rad, suggest this isn't just an angel, but likely a manifestation of God himself, a theophany.
God appearing in a form that allows interaction.
Yeah, allowing personal involvement while maintaining divine transcendence. It makes Hagar's encounter even more profound. She's met with God directly.
That really elevates the significance. And what about Ishmael's name, God has heard? Is there more to it?
Well, Sarna suggests a kind of dual audience for the name. Primarily, yes, it commemorates God hearing Hagar's misery, as the angel explicitly says.
Okay, that's clear.
But secondarily, it might also subtly acknowledge God hearing Abram's own long years of prayer and longing for a son.
Ah, so even though Ishmael isn't the promised heir through Sarai,
God still heard Abram's desire and blessed Ishmael in his own way. The name reflects both Hagar's immediate suffering and Abram's long-term plea.
that adds another layer of nuance. These scholarly perspectives really do enrich the reading. Now, thinking about those unique insights, the things that maybe make you stop and say, I never thought of it that way, what specific aha moments have scholars drawn from this story of Hagar?
One thing that really stands out is Hagar's flight path, something Hamilton highlights. She's heading towards Shur, towards Egypt.
Right, back to what she knew, her safe place, presumably.
Exactly. It's such a human reaction run towards the familiar when you're hurt and scared. But the aha moment is that God finds her on that path.
He doesn't wait for her to turn around or figure things out.
No. He intercepts her on her way back to what might have been perceived security, but perhaps also bondage. It shows God's grace actively pursuing us, even when we're running in what might be the wrong direction.
That's a powerful picture of prevenient grace. God reaching out first. And what about Hagar naming God? That seems incredibly unique.
It really is. Waltke, Kidner in the Tyndale series, Wearsby, they all emphasize how extraordinary this is. Usually, God names people or places in the Bible.
It signifies his authority and purpose.
Exactly. But here, Hagar, the Egyptian slave woman, names God, Uldru, the God who sees me.
It speaks volumes about her personal experience, doesn't it?
It reflects such a deep personal recognition of his character based on her encounter. And Bir Lahai Roy, the well, becomes a lasting monument to her experience of God seeing her. It's quite revolutionary, really.
It truly centers her testimony.
Yeah.
And the description of Ishmael as a wild donkey, is there more to that imagery?
Yeah, scholars like Thompson have analyzed that paradigm description. In the ancient world, the wild donkey wasn't just wild. It symbolized freedom, resilience, the ability to thrive in the desert away from settled life.
So it's less an insult and more a characterization.
More a description of a lifestyle and a spirit. It foreshadows the independent, nomadic nature of his descendants, the desert dwellers. It's not necessarily negative, but depicts their character fiercely independent, tough, suited to the wilderness. It's a different kind of destiny than Isaac's.
Understanding that cultural symbolism changes how you hear that description, these insights definitely add fresh perspective. Okay, let's pivot now to application. Thinking about today's believers, and especially those listening who are involved in ministry, what are the core reminders or lessons we should be taking away from this deep dive into Genesis 16? How does this ancient story speak into our lives and service now?
Well, one absolutely fundamental takeaway has to be the contrast between human schemes and God's promises.
Sarai and Abram trying to help God out.
Exactly. Their plan, likely born from good intentions mixed with a patience, led directly to conflict, pain, fractured relationships. It's a huge warning sign for us.
You see that echoed in ministry sometimes, don't you? Trying to force results or engineer outcomes based on our own understanding or timing.
Absolutely. Walkie and Wearsby really drive this home. Relying on human wisdom, even to achieve what we think are God's goals, often brings unexpected difficulties if we deviate from his specific will and timing.
So the call is really to trust God's faithfulness, his methods, his schedule, even when it's hard to wait.
Patience and trust, rather than trying to manipulate the circumstances ourselves. That's key.
That's a big one. What else stands out?
God's incredible care for the suffering and the marginalized. That shines through so brightly here.
With Hagar, the Egyptian slave, lost in the desert.
Yes. God actively seeks her out in her despair. He comforts her, provides for her, gives her promises. It shows his heart for the lowly, the oppressed.
And his grace isn't limited by ethnicity or social status.
Not at all. Baldwin and Hamilton stress this. Believers today can find so much comfort in this, knowing God sees our suffering, whatever our situation, and he reaches out. No one is invisible to him.
That's incredibly encouraging. And what about the command for Hagar to return and submit? That's a difficult part of the story.
It is difficult. Returning to mistreatment, submitting to it. That's a hard command. Yet it was through that obedience that the promise came.
The promise of numerous descendants for Ishmael.
Right. It teaches us something profound, as Waltke notes. Obedience to God's will can be costly. It might mean going back into tough situations.
But blessing can follow that costly obedience.
Often it does. It challenges our idea that blessing just means ease and comfort. Sometimes growth and God's purposes unfold through the hard path of obedience.
That requires a lot of trust. And finally, the chapter really shows God at work even amidst family conflict, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a raw portrayal of conflict sparked by human weakness and sin. Jealousy, blame, mistreatment. It's all there.
But God isn't absent in the mess.
No, he remains sovereign. He's guiding events, showing both discipline and grace, working towards his larger purposes. As Baldwin points out, it reminds us to seek God's wisdom in our own family or church tensions.
Trusting that he is still at work, even in our human imperfections and conflicts.
Exactly. He can bring his purposes out of our messes.
These are really powerful reminders for our lives and ministries. Just before we wrap up, maybe touch on a couple of those extra pieces of information scholars provide, like the status of a concubine.
Sure. Understanding Hagar's status as essentially a concubine, Pilijah, or the functional use of Yeshua here, is important context.
Her position was different from Sarai's, the primary wife.
Yes, significantly lower status, mainly for procreation. Her rights and her children's rights often depended heavily on the specific family situation and local customs. And being Sarai's slave on top of that made her position even more precarious.
It really highlights the power imbalance and her vulnerability, and the significance of naming places.
Right, like Bir Lahai Roy. These aren't just dots on a map. Hagar naming God, the well-being named. These are spiritual markers.
Testimonies to a personal encounter.
Exactly. They witness Hagar's faith experience, reminding everyone of the God who sees, hears, and appears. Their continued mention keeps that history alive.
And the location itself, the spring on the road to shore.
The geography matters too. Sure, the border of Egypt, a spring symbolizing life in the desert. God meets this desperate Egyptian woman running back towards her past at a place of life, offering her a future. It's geographically and symbolically potent, as Sarna and Waltke note.
It really ties everything together beautifully. So as we reflect on this whole deep dive into Genesis 16, It's just such a powerful narrative, isn't it? Full of human frailty, cultural nuances.
And yet overarching everything is this picture of God's unwavering care, his personal attention.
The story of Hagar is just such a profound reminder that God sees and hears those who feel overlooked, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And his promises, his grace, they extend way beyond our plans or expectations. Even when things go wrong because of human choices, God's sovereignty somehow works through it all.
And for those of us in ministry, there are such deep insights here about navigating complex relationships, trusting God's timing.
Especially when things seem impossible or delayed, resisting that urge to fix things ourselves.
And it really challenges us, I think, to consider how we see and treat those on the margins in our own communities.
Remembering that God himself sought out Hagar in her distress. He went to her.
So as we conclude, perhaps a thought to carry with you is this. How might truly grasping that God is Ildri, the God who sees me, how might that shape your understanding of his presence in your own life, your own ministry, especially in those hard times or when you feel unseen?
That's a powerful truth to hold on to. And maybe extending that thought, especially for those serving Hagar's story, insists that God's ear is open to the cries of everyone, regardless of their background or status. It calls us, doesn't it, to cultivate ministries that truly see and value every single person, reflecting the heart of the God who sees.